Kate, and this is Julie and Quinn, and we are investigating the change in forest ecology within Point Pleasant Park, Nova Scotia, following Hurricane Juan.
So in terms of past research, there have been longitudinal studies on forest succession, but few on Acadian forests. And the research on Acadian forests focuses on very specific questions. Turchin did study succession in Point Pleasant Park, but sampled less often and over a shorter time frame. Succession describes how a community gradually changes after experiencing a disturbance and can be primary or secondary. In primary succession, geological changes happen to an existing substrate or create a new substrate. But in secondary succession, disturbances remove community members but do not impact substrate. And during succession, it's normal for the abundance, richness, diversity, and evenness of the species to change. Now, Nova Scotia is comprised of Acadian forests, which are unique to the Maritime provinces and northeastern states. And they're composed of mainly spruce, maple, birch, fir, cedar, beech, ash, hemlock, poplar, larch, and pine trees. Now, a great example of secondary succession in an Acadian forest is Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And this park is specifically important to the Mi'kmaq Nation, and they called it Armendu, since they believe that the spirit of the warrior Armendu lives there and guards them from dangers entering from the ocean. However, in 2003, Hurricane Juan hit Halifax, and it was a Category 2 hurricane that removed 70% of the trees in the park. Now, our research focuses on secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan. And this experiment will be unique in that it will be the longest, most frequently sampled study on succession in Point Pleasant Park. And this will give the most accurate big picture idea of how Point Pleasant Park is recovering. So now let's dive more specifically into our research. This experiment answers the question, how have the overall forest community, dominant species, and community metrics changed in Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan? And from this research question, we have generated 3 hypotheses, each referring to Point Pleasant Park between 2004 and 2023. Now, for the first set, the alternative hypothesis is that there is a change in the overall forest community. In the second set, the alternative hypothesis is that there is a change in the density of the dominant species. And finally, the alternative hypothesis for the third set is that there is a change in the species richness. And for each set, the null hypothesis is that there is no change. Based on these hypotheses, we made 3 predictions. We predict that the forest as a whole will increase in density and diversity until it reaches its climax community. And we also predict that the dominant species will remain the same but become more dense, and the overall species richness will increase. And to test these hypotheses, we gathered data from the trees in Point Pleasant Park and analyzed it to observe any trends between these 2 dates.
6 sites were analyzed in Point Pleasant Park, Nova Scotia. The sites were spread around in different locations in the park and acted as replicates for the study. Analysis was conducted annually from 2004 onward after the impact of Hurricane Juan. Point Pleasant Park was used for the study because it was highly disturbed by Hurricane Juan, so it's a great place to study secondary succession. There was a few years where data was not collected because of hurricanes and the COVID-19 pandemic, and due to weather and other circumstances, not all sites were sampled every year. Data was collected at each site by measuring the diameter at breast height, or 4.5 feet from the ground, using a diameter tape. And trees were considered anything greater than 2.5 inches at diameter at breast height. Each species was also identified, and the data was collected on the density of each species by measuring the number of individuals of that species in the study area. Linear regression analysis was used to analyze the data. This allows us to see the trends in how the forest community is changing over time, as well as make predictions for the future. And it allows us to answer our hypotheses about how the overall forest community, density of dominant species, and species richness have changed in Point Pleasant Park after the impact of Hurricane Juan.
This data shows the effects of diversity from secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park. To determine diversity, the 6 sites routinely assessed for number of species present, the proportion of each species to the total number of individuals, as well as the sums of the proportion times the natural log proportion per species. Using regression analysis, we explored the relationship of diversity in the Shannon index with a p-value of 2.2 times 10 to the negative 16 and an r-squared value of 0.3303. This shows steady increase of diversity following for Hurricane Juan. The forest is constantly growing and changing every day on its route to back to what it became. The Shannon Diversity Complex shows an increase of about 1.5 along the line of regression, from 0.5 to 2 over the course of about 15 years. This is supported by succession theory and states that the richness and diversity will increase after disturbance as the establishing community takes advantage of the new resources, as stated by Turchin in 2016. This supports our alternative hypothesis.
Now, the two dominant tree species in Point Pleasant Park are the red spruce and the red maple. And here we have the density of both plotted on two separate graphs. On the y-axis, we have the density of the tree, and this is the number of trees present within 400 square meter quadrats. And on our x-axis, we have the year. So as we can see in 2004, the red spruce had a density of 1 and the red maple had a density of 0. And this would make the red spruce the dominant species immediately after Hurricane Juan. However, the density of the red maple increases at a much faster rate than that of the red spruce. So in 2022, the red maple has a density of 38 and the red spruce has a density of 4. So currently, the red maple is the dominant species. And we use linear regression analysis to examine how the density of red spruce and red maple in Point Pleasant Park changed between 2004 and 2022. And to do so, we collected data on both species from Point Pleasant Park annually. Now, there was a weak positive relationship between red spruce density and time, and given that the p-value is less than 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis and support the alternative hypothesis from set 2. And there was also a weak positive relationship between red maple density and time, and given that p-value is once again less than 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis and can further support the alternative hypothesis from set 2. Now, both the red spruce and red maple densities increase to return to their climax community densities and restore the canopy. And the dominant species change from red spruce to red maple because the red maple is the dominant species in the climax community. So both densities will continue to increase until they reach their climax densities.
To examine how richness has changed in Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan, we measured the number of species per 400 meters squared annually from 2004 to the present. We used regression analysis to explore how the species richness has changed over time. This can be seen in Figure 7 here. There is a significant positive relationship between species richness, which was the number of species per 400 meters squared, and year, with an R-squared value of 0.66, an F-statistic of 142.2, and a p-value of 2.2 times 10 to the negative 6. Our results yielded a very small probability value for species richness, so therefore our null hypothesis that richness did not change was rejected, supporting our alternative hypothesis that species richness increased during the period of secondary succession after Point Pleasant Park was hit by Hurricane Juan. This finding agrees with published work, such as Turchin 2016, that found species richness to increase in Point Pleasant Park between 2006 and 2016. Because the graph does not appear to level out, this trajectory will likely be maintained as species richness continues to increase until the forest reaches its climax community. These findings are important because they show that in the secondary succession after a hurricane, species richness will increase, and we can predict that the species richness will continue to increase at Point Pleasant Park because it is yet to reach its climax population.
Due to the data shown, we believe the forest is in mid-succession. Diversity and density is increasing consistently over time, removing the option of it being later stages of succession. Going forward, as the forest reaches its climax community, we believe the forest will look very similar to what it did before the disturbance, as the replanting plan set in place by HRM will likely produce a similar even-aged forest. It is noticed in the HRM Point Pleasant Park Comprehensive Plan from 2008, their main goal is to preserve the park long-term. With this in mind, the comprehensive plan also acknowledges that when managing urban forests, we must choose between preserving natural ecological patterns and processes or prioritizing public demands such as durability of the forest in a future disturbance, as stated by Esperly et al. In 2008. As this is an HRM project, succession will not exactly follow as it would in nature due to human involvement such as forest management and recreational use, but overall, the whole park is progressing as expected through the stages of succession as noted by Turchin in 2016. The Mi'kmaq have a concept known as the 7 generations understanding that could be implemented to help us how we act around our forests. The 7 generations understanding is thinking about how your actions will affect your people and future generations. So, how your actions will affect the lives of your children's 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 children, or about 150 years down the road. Our data supports all 3 of our alternative hypotheses, therefore we reject all of our null hypotheses.
So finally, we just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who helped in the process of completing this experiment and putting this presentation together. So first off, this study would not be possible without the students who took this class before us and collected the data in previous years. And we also owe a huge thank you to Dr. Allison Schmidt, the lab coordinator for this course. She designed and facilitated this experiment as well as analyzed and graphed all of the data. And the other guiding figure in this class is Abigail Target, our demonstrator marker, and she helped guide us when making this presentation by answering any questions. As well, we'd like to thank our fellow ecology students for providing us with feedback to improve our draft.
Based on our presentation, we have 3 questions to answer. The first is, how can our results be used to inform future conservation and restoration efforts in urban parks affected by natural disasters? Our results have given a better understanding of how urban parks and Acadian forests specifically change and recover during the period of secondary succession after a natural disaster. Conservation and restoration efforts would benefit from knowledge that species richness, dominant species, and overall ecology can increase after a major disturbance. Point Pleasant Park has been relatively successful in recovering naturally with its Acadian forest flora. This can be used as a model when decisions are made about restoration of other similar urban parks.
So Point Pleasant Park is a high traffic area in an urbanized location, so it receives a lot of human impacts. And for example, people walk their dogs and allow them to urinate on the floors and the trees. Now, the dog urine contains nitrate, which can damage the roots and burn through the leaves. And in particular, very young or very old trees are less resistant to nitrate damage, as well as maple trees. And many trees in Point Pleasant Park are new, and maple trees are the dominant species. Therefore, dog urine can impede the recovery of flora and trees in Point Pleasant Park. As well, Point Pleasant Park, as discussed, is a high traffic area, but also there's a lot of school activities and picnics that occur. And as a result of this, a lot of littering happens on the trails. And a study by Zion and Nielsen shows that litter negatively impacts vegetation growth. And in particular, it negatively impacts the germination, richness, and above ground biomass. Trees are also impacted more than grasses and forbs. So, humans are unintentionally impeding the recovery of plants, particularly trees, due to litter. And of course, these are only a few examples.
Finally, our last question to answer is if a similar disturbance were to occur. We would expect a very similar outcome due to the comprehensive plan put forth by HRM that prioritized preserving the forest as it was ecologically. As stated in Turchin 2016, current and past management plans emphasize the importance of fostering natural mechanisms of regeneration within the park, which means that they're prioritizing that over the durability of a forest. However, the damage would most likely not be as severe, as Turchin also mentions that Point Pleasant Park was originally so devastated due to the lack of younger and mid-sized trees and shrubs to soften the blow of the wind. Now, because there are more mid-sized and younger trees, it will help soften the blow of the damage. The other notable difference is we know so much more about the forest now due to this happening. Originally, we were removing woody debris to prevent fire hazards and protect the public. However, when we remove those woody debris, we also take the nutrients with them. So, in an attempt to better manage the soil, we should now be leaving them in here, and HRM can use this information learned to better take care of the park.
Thank you for joining us for this presentation.